Russia's prized S300 air defense system has just been obliterated, and it wasn't even close. In a stunning show of force, Israeli F-35s wiped out 3 of Iran's Russian-made S300 batteries in late October, leaving Iran's skies wide open. The attack didn't just expose Iran's vulnerabilities, it embarrassed Russia. These systems were supposed to represent the pinnacle of Russian engineering, yet they crumbled against a modern assault. And if the S-300 can't handle Israeli strikes, what does that say about Russia's ability to defend its own airspace in a world dominated by Western firepower? This wasn't just an attack, it was a statement. So how did Israel's F-35s pull it off? And what does this mean for the future of Russian military tech? Let's break it down. The S-300s that were destroyed in Iran by the attack were Russian-based S-300 PMU-2, the export versions of the native S-300, and therefore with slightly lower operational capabilities, much like most exported weapon systems. The S-300 was, for a long time, considered one of the most effective anti-air systems in the world. However, the S-300 was developed in the 1970s, when Russia was still the Soviet Union. The S-300 initially entered service in the 1980s as a mid-range missile system. The premise was relatively simple. Traditional air defenses were largely stationary and needed significant setup time to be at their most effective. When the S-300 was first developed, the Soviet Union already had a long-range missile system in the then-aging S-200, which could strike down targets from 190 miles away. Therefore, the first iterations of the S-300 started with a 60-mile range. However, the initial range constraints of the S-300 wouldn't last for long, as the Soviet Union rapidly improved the system's performance. The hallmark of the S-300, compared to the other systems of its time, was the ability to quickly relocate after firing while still boasting extremely potent anti-aircraft and anti-missile capabilities. This meant that the enemy would need to launch a devastating initial attack, something that many countries were unable to do at the time. Otherwise, due to the system's inherent mobility, it could strike down incoming missiles or aircraft and then reposition itself to prevent its position from being revealed to the enemy. However, the first real improvements of the S-300 came in the 1990s, with the system's range doubling to roughly 120 miles. While this was still a much lower area than the S-200s could cover, the missiles that the later system used were less than a quarter of the size. This meant that the entire system could actually transport missiles en masse between vital locations, greatly improving the effective range that the anti-air defense could actually cover during any given period. The S-200 was relegated to being fixed since its missiles were effective at long range and fast, but the entire battery couldn't really move, as the launcher was too big for traditional transport. In contrast, the S-300 was highly mobile, making it more effective at leveraging its reduced range, while also improving the military's operational capabilities. With the S-300, the Soviet Union, and later Russia, could actually start moving the systems in more offensive positions, rather than purely defensive ones. Since it could move, the system was significantly more protected than its earlier counterpart. But perhaps the biggest change came in the form of a remodeled launcher design. The version of the S-300 that debuted in the 90s, dubbed the S-300 PMU, could deploy multiple missiles simultaneously, ostensibly due to each missile being relatively smaller and lighter. The advancement was the first of its kind in the world, as all anti-air defenses up until then had single-use launchers and significant reload times. This allowed the system to have a significantly better response time to detected threats. If an enemy launched a large-scale attack, the improved design of the PMU meant that it was more likely to be able to mount a sufficient defensive measure. Additionally, an enemy attacking in waves would allow the defensive system to reload the missiles quicker, due to them being easier to transport and mount. The improvements effectively meant that the S-300 could only feasibly be countered by an enemy using overwhelming force, creating an attack so numerous that no other defensive system would be able to counter it effectively. At the time, the long-range missiles that were being used simply weren't that effective, nor did the national militaries possess the numeric power to overcome the boosted anti-air defenses. The ability to shoot multiple anti-air missiles, paired with mobility that allowed it to escape triangulation without extensive prior surveillance, made the S-300 one of the best, if not the best, defensive system of its kind anywhere in the world. Throughout the 1990s, Russia was commonly considered one of the best defended countries from aerial attacks. But then again, the S-300 was first developed in the 1980s and only improved in the 90s. Of course, there have been some modifications to the system since then, but the more recent version, dubbed the S-400, was only deployed in 2007. This means the S-300 is an increasingly aging system compared to model missile defense standards. The acquisition of a suitable anti-air defense system was on Iran's agenda for decades, considering its long-standing conflict with Israel and the West as a whole. However, there was a setback. Iran has been under Western sanctions throughout that time. Their bid to buy a few S-300 systems started all the way back in 2000, but the Kremlin effectively self-imposed an export ban, at least to Iran. A similar deal was proposed in 2010, when Iran was under less restrictive sanctions, and Russia had already started replacing its native stock with the more advanced S400. But again, the Kremlin refused to sell the S300s, once again succumbing to pressure from the West as Iran was still under sanctions. The deal finally went through in 2015, with Iran buying 4 S300 systems from Russia. For the last decades, the S300s were the most advanced anti-air systems that Iran fielded. Nevertheless, Israel has managed to take out these systems by using F-35s and air-to-surface missiles. The F-35 was also designed in the late 80s, effectively making it contemporary to the S-300, at least the versions that were exported to Iran in 2015. However, it's clear that more modern missile designs were pivotal in creating an edge against the system. The S-300 as it stands today is considered to be insufficient when dealing with high-speed missiles. The S-300s that are used by Russia, especially in the ongoing war in Ukraine, are only able to do as much as they are because the Russian anti-air defenses have more layers than just the S-300s. The Russian military has access to multiple improved versions of the S-300, including the aforementioned S-400 and a battery of much more modern S-500, which debuted in 2021. As such, Iran relying on only its very small number of S-300s, compared to the number of missiles Israel could launch at any time, means that the country realistically didn't stand much of a chance to begin with. Even worse, the S-300s have already been shown to be partially ineffective against weapons even from their own generation. An S-300 battery in 2022 failed to hit a retreating F-16 after Israel conducted a strike on Iranian military compounds in Syria. The F-16 is an aerial platform that has significantly lower electronic warfare capabilities. In theory, an F-16 should be easily countered by the more advanced versions of the S-300, such as the one Iran had at the time. But there's more where that came from, as Iran is not the only country that uses them. As mentioned, Russia has been fielding S-300s in its war against Ukraine. And there, the weaknesses of this system have been on full display. There have been several reports over the past 2.5 years of Ukrainian long-range targeted strikes hitting, and in most cases destroying, Russian S-300s. The same actually happened to Ukraine itself, as it had a decent stockpile of S-300s, albeit somewhat older models from its tenure as a Soviet country. Even the more advanced S-400s have fallen victim to the Ukrainian counteroffensive. By the way, this came at a time when Ukraine didn't have any sort of modern airplanes. The F-16s that Ukraine would eventually receive only started flying over Ukraine in August 2024, roughly 2.5 years after the war started. With that in mind, it's become clear that even slightly older anti-air defense systems are no longer the be-all and end-all of dissuading against long-range strikes. The S-300s, which are by now more than 40 years old as a design, are clearly showing their age. But let's turn back to Iran's problem. With no real anti-air defenses remaining in the country, Iran's extensive military systems and compounds have no actual protection against airstrikes. This is an especially dangerous precedent, considering that Israel has some of the most advanced long-range weapons in the world due to receiving significant amounts of economic and military aid from the US. With Iran pretty much in open war with Israel over the past few months in everything but name and large-scale battles, the country's future of being able to pressure Israel militarily might be coming to an end. Ever since the conflict between Hamas and Israel started intensifying, Iran has managed to hide behind its proxy groups in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Thus, Iran's anti-air defenses created a secondary layer of protection. None of these proxies had significant defensive capabilities, launching long-range strikes with impunity and using the presence of civilians in hopes of dissuading Israel from launching a counteroffensive. This meant that Israel was far more likely to go against easier targets in order to save on missiles and minimize the risk of losing valuable aircraft. But with the escalation of Iran's attacks against Israel, particularly with Iran itself starting to launch missiles directly into Israeli territory, it's become clear that roundabout tactics were no longer the best way for Israel to defend itself. Thus, Israel removing Iran's scant anti-air defenses sent out a clear message. Iran should back off from Israel, stop the missile attacks, and stop funding paramilitary groups across the region. Otherwise, Israel is going to launch increasingly devastating attacks on Iran itself. With no S-300s to soak up the missiles, the coast is clear for the Israeli attack to strike vital military compounds, including proposed nuclear enrichment facilities that Iran has been building over the last few years. Also worth considering is the fact that Israel hasn't been particularly affected by a year-long assault from Iran-funded proxies. For over a year, the country has repelled missile strike after missile strike from pretty much every possible side. Most of the long-range missiles failed to hit Israel at all, with the US and Israeli intelligence and defenses picking them off at breakneck speeds. In contrast, the attack on Iran's S-300s were among the few times Israel attacked Iran itself, and the damage was something that Iran won't be able to repair soon, which cements Israel as having far higher offensive capabilities than Iran. Previous Israeli strikes had a similar goal, testing and disabling Iranian defenses. An earlier attack on an S300 battery in Iran was conducted using solely long-range ballistic missiles rather than aircraft. Satellite imagery after the attack showed that the area was severely damaged. Ballistic missiles had the advantage of not requiring the Israeli Air Force to enter the Iranian airspace, which would potentially put them in range of the S300 systems themselves. However, the ballistic missile's relatively shorter operational range, compared to that of F-35s, meant that Israel could only strike at targets closer to its own territory. The attack was nevertheless considered at least partially successful, considering that it was the first time Israel decided to test Iran's defenses. Obviously, the subsequent larger-scale attack was partially based on the results of that test. Unlike Russia, Iran doesn't have a domestic supply of anti-air defense systems. Iran relied on Russia for major weapons and equipment supplies over the past decade. However, with Russia itself in a war with Ukraine, there's pretty much no possibility of Russia handing over its own stockpiles of S-300s. Considering that their own S-300s are no longer performing as well as they should on the Ukrainian front line, Russia is most likely going to need a large number of more advanced models, S-400 and 500. And that makes it even less likely that Russia will share its defense systems with Iran in the near future. But what does this mean for those two countries? Throughout the war in Ukraine and the later conflict between Israel and Hamas, which spurred Iran to act against Israel, Russia and Iran have found themselves in a geopolitical conflict against the Western states, chiefly NATO and its closest allies and Israel itself. The countries have effectively been swapping pieces of equipment with each other, depending on what types of weapons each country could produce natively. Iran is perhaps one of the most notorious long-range missile and drone producers in the world. Iranian drones have frequently been deployed from Russia and used to target the Ukrainian military and other strategic targets. Meanwhile, Iran has also been supplying its many proxies around Israel with pretty much the same type of weapons. The scale at which Iran has been producing missiles and drones can even be comparable to that of Western countries. Of course, Israeli and NATO anti-air defenses have largely been more than enough to shoot down a vast majority of these weapons from the sky. That means that Iran has been likely steadily losing its supply of long-range weapons, mainly in a futile attempt to dissuade Israel from making any aggressive moves against Hamas and the West Bank. Granted, the relentless missile strikes from Iranian proxies have forced Israel and the US to retaliate. So in a way, the missile supplies that Iran has sent did have some purpose. On the grand scale of what is achieved in Israel, however, this might not be as meaningful as Iran had hoped. Iran's ability to manufacture drones largely relies on the extreme markup the country is extorting from Russia. A Shahid 136 drone, one of the most common drones used in both Iran and Russia, costs between $20,000 and $50,000 for Iran to manufacture. However, Iran sells the weapon to Russia for an astounding $193,000. Even if we consider the highest possible production cost for the weapon, Iran is still extracting more than $140,000 per drone that it sells to Russia. How is Iran able to do this? Because over the past 2 years, Russia has been in desperate need for more long-range weapons. Throughout the war in Ukraine, the Russian military hasn't really proven to be successful at defeating the Ukrainian forces, despite the overwhelming numerical advantage that Russia had at the start of the war. This could be attributed to several factors, chief of which being the lack of adaptability on Russia's side. But one of the ways in which Russia has been consistently able to pressure Ukraine is through long-range presence. This comes in two types: artillery and missiles. For artillery, it's estimated that Russia and its allies produce roughly 3 times as many artillery shells as the West. NATO has been able to send roughly 1 million rounds per year to Ukraine by using domestic production capabilities, but Russia, on the other hand, has the potential to make 3 million rounds. North Korea has also been responsible for delivering artillery rounds to Russia, with estimates ranging from 500,000 to 3 million rounds over the course of 6 months in late 2023. Additionally, Russia is estimated to have the largest stockpiles of artillery launchers, including both towed and self-propelled artillery. Russia's artillery systems are also considered to be more modern than the comparable Western designs, with either a longer range or a higher rate of fire, depending on the exact weapon. On the other hand, Russia has been using missiles indiscriminately to conduct long-range attacks on Ukrainian territory, aimed at cutting off the Ukrainian military from the front. When combined with the ever-present artillery that Russia can field, Ukraine has been on the back foot for most of the war. But the missiles and military drones that Russia produces are subpar compared to the Iranian ones. This is why Russia has grown dependent on support from Iran to supply more modern missiles to allow it to continue the assault. Russia's need to buy more and more missiles from Iran means that Iran is receiving funding for its own war efforts against Israel. But that lasts only as long as both Iran and Russia can maintain their defensive systems. When Ukraine moved on its offensive in Kursk, the tide of the battle turned in its favor. Russia's response to the Kursk invasion was significantly delayed, probably due to the extreme equipment shortage and soldier fatigue across the country. As a result, Russia was forced to slightly refocus its efforts. While it still used long-range missiles, it needed to shore up its defensive line, mainly by making more use of its existing anti-air defenses. This became even more necessary in September, when Ukraine started making its own long-range strikes deep into Russian territory. In fact, on September 10th, Ukraine launched a large-scale drone attack that targeted the Russian capital of Moscow, among other vital military targets. With Russia on the defensive for once, Iran is suddenly cut off from one of the few sources of income it had. To counter that, Iran has been riling up the Middle East, forcing the West to look away from the war in Ukraine and focus its efforts on the humanitarian crisis going on in and around Israel. However, that might not be enough. You see, the most recent Israeli attack utilized F-35 jets, which have been considered the pinnacle of fighter jets for decades. The plane's adaptability and stealth capabilities have allowed the West to pretty much dominate the skies wherever they go, given adequate land support and surveillance to get the targets they needed. And yet the plane is not designed for carrying bombs, including penetrative air-to-surface missiles that can dig through dozens of feet of ground and cement. That's where stealth bombers come in. The US has announced a replacement for the existing stealth bomber, the B-2. The new B-21 Raider had its debut flight in November 2023, and the US Air Force is already planning to replace the 19 B-2s that it has with between 100 and 200 B-21s. This confidence in the B-21's performance shows that the US sees the ability to strike any ground target, no matter how far or how protected it is, to be a pivotal part of modern warfare. And B-2s have been used to great effect by the US military in Yemen to dismantle Houthi weapons storage facilities. With the F-35 as the most modern Israeli plane that can carry bombs, the country doesn't actually have a good complement for all its firepower. But as soon as the B-21 goes out of production, the US, being one of Israel's closest allies, might be able and willing to coordinate the delivery of the newest stealth bombers and use them against Iranian defenses. In a way, Israel using the F-35s against S-300s showcases what a relatively modern airplane can do against obsoleting anti-air defense systems. However, with the US getting a more advanced stealth bomber to significantly boost air-to-surface operational capabilities, the showcase is actually meant more as a threat to Iran. Because if Israel has so far managed to keep Iran in check by using US-provided weaponry that was of the previous generation, imagine what it could do with the next generation designs. And through that threat, Russia is also about to receive a wake-up call. As the war in Ukraine rages on, the country is quickly losing its geopolitical influence and money. The Russian economy has started practically eating away at all industries at the expense of the military and the energy sector, but the returns are only going to be worthwhile in the extreme short term. This means that Russia's likely going to run out of ways to give Iran something in exchange for long-range missiles. Without that exchange, both countries stand to lose significant offensive and defensive potential. The West can then work against the weakened alliance and completely break it by imposing even tougher sanctions than before. But what do you think? How is the situation between Israel and Iran going to develop, and how will it affect Russia? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out how the F-35 Lightning II devastated Houthi pirates, or click this other video instead.